Welcome to Eternal Dread, where fear never sleeps. Tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is, because terror has no limits. If you're brave enough, share and comment, but beware, something might be watching you too. Now, turn off the lights, and let the dread begin. Dr. Daniel Vance was a smart man. Too smart for his own good, maybe. 40 years old, a lecturer in fluid dynamics with a mind made of shapes and numbers. No one knows why, but one day, on a whim, he crunched the numbers on the apocalypse and came to a troubling conclusion. He didn't share exactly what it was he'd deduced, but given that he immediately quit his job and liquidated his many assets, it's fair to say it wasn't positive. Swept up in the wake of this tremendous upheaval was his wife, a 24-year-old PhD student who had grown infatuated with Daniel some time before. She loved the strange bear of a man who could just as easily build a log cabin as he could explain the idiosyncrasies of an asteroid's orbit. Speaking to Daniel always left you with the profound impression he was right. So when he told her what he wanted to do, she agreed. 15 years and 5 children later, the Vances were living in the distant woods just beyond my hometown. They were enigmatic, richer than the Pope, and extremely serious about their prepper lifestyle. But they were also funny, easygoing, and incredibly compelling to speak to. Larger-than-life survivalists who swept into town with bizarre requests that thrilled local businesses. Vast quantities of cement, iron, lead, and steel were all shipped through the remote mountains so that the Vances could build their shelter. The advanced methods they used to keep it secret were legendary. Daniel had once spent 6 months earning the license necessary to drive HGVs up to his compound so that no one else would lay eyes on it. And on one occasion, when a company had refused his request for GPS tracker-free vehicles, he bought them out wholesale so that they had no choice. So when they stopped appearing in town during the pandemic, when requests for food and goods stopped and all contact was dropped, most attributed it to lockdown. They had a bunker and had spent their entire lives training to be self-sufficient in the face of civilization's collapse. Even Alexander, the youngest at just 3, was already collecting firewood as a chore and learning what local plants were edible. Most of us just assumed that if anyone could ride out COVID without breaking a sweat, it would be the Vances. The reality turned out to be something else. When the worst came to light, we discovered that Daniel had used the pandemic as an excuse for a dry run. The family intended to spend 6 months in lockdown and essentially beta test their fallout bunker. 3 months in, and the sheriff received a distress call on the radio. Coordinates were provided by the hushed voice of a sobbing child that most assume was Alexander, even though that's never been proven. The police arrived and found the bunker still sealed. It took hours for emergency responders to cut into the door. All the while, efforts were made to contact the family within, but to no avail. Once inside, police were left dumbfounded. There was no one to be rescued. No bodies. No survivors. There was evidence the door's locking mechanism had failed and trapped the Vances inside with no way out. But if so, where had they gone? Beds and cots lay everywhere with moldering yellow sheets, buckets close to hand with stains all around them. Some doors were barred, others smashed to pieces. There was even evidence of makeshift quarantines and, in places, what looked like violence. The police, usually a fantastic source of gossip, were not forthcoming until the town demanded answers, and the sheriff was forced to offer only the barest of outlines. An outbreak of a waterborne illness had struck the Vances down not long after they were locked inside and unable to seek help. Rumors of contagion were overstated, fueled by the unrelated rise of COVID. Whatever contaminant had killed the Vances, it was non-organic in nature. No need to panic. The Vances loved ones had been notified. The bunker was going to be demolished, and we could all put this terrible tragedy behind us. Of course, we still had questions. 1,000 of them. Why hadn't the family called for help? They had radios, computers, smartphones too. They were survivalists, not Amish. And where were they? What had happened to their bodies? Why hadn't they simply left? We shouted these and more at the town meeting, but the police simply refused to comment. For most of us, the excitement lasted another week or 2 until we realized we weren't getting answers anytime soon. Besides, the pandemic was in full swing, and most of us had other things to worry about. The tragic story eventually faded until it was just one of those awful things in the town's history that we didn't talk about. I was as guilty as anyone else of just forgetting about it. I certainly never expected to find the bunker out there in the woods. Faded police tape still on the open door that hung wide open with scorch marks around the lock. It stood out in the woods like someone had cut a hole right in the fabric of reality. The darkness so deep and black it almost ached to look at. The sight of it made my heart drop into my stomach. It radiated pain. Does that make sense? I think some part of my lizard brain picked out details that wouldn't become apparent to me until I got closer, like the bloody finger streaks that stained the handle from where someone had scrabbled furiously at the lock without success, and the tiny viewing window had been smashed with a hammer that still lay nearby. I needed only to glimpse it to imagine the family taking turns to stand there and scream into the woods desperate for rescue. Under any other circumstances, I would have run. But I'd gone there looking for my dog, and my light revealed a few wet paw prints making their way down the dusty concrete tunnel. Half Bernese and half collie, Ripley is the sort of dog who trembles in my arms when a storm buffets the windows and needs his paws held when we brush him. I love him. I do not have much of a family or a wife or even many friends. But I have Ripley, and I could no more have turned around and gone home to an empty apartment where I would have to sob my grief away than I could flap my arms and fly. He was my dog and I'd raised him since he was a puppy, and I wasn't going to leave him out in those woods. I went in after him. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew it wouldn't be good. Whatever the police had found, they'd not only kept most of the morbid details to themselves, they had also lied. The bunker was not demolished or even sealed off. In fact, looking at the occasional blue latex glove tossed aside and the one or two broken police-issue flashlights, it seemed like the last people inside had been in a hurry to get out. Given this was where 7 people had presumably died, I assumed it was someone's job to clean it all up. But the corridor looked largely untouched. Just a few meters in and manic writing started to cover the walls, the desperate scrawls of a lone survivor left there to be rediscovered like cave paintings. Most were deliberations on how to get out. Diagrams, blueprints, equations and formulae, all focused on the door and the circuits responsible for its faulty lock. I instinctively assumed they belonged to Daniel, and that he'd been the last to die. What a god-awful fate for a man to outlive his children. And yet it got worse. Slowly the writing changed from equations and plans to a desperate scrawl. The same few phrases repeated over and over. 5 doors. 5. Not 6. 6. Didn't make it. Didn't make it. 6 doors. 6. It seemed like the kind of thing you'd find in an asylum. A psychotic rambling punctuated only by 6 paragraphs right at the end. Each letter was impeccably neat, and each small paragraph was topped with a beautifully drawn Christian cross. Elliot Vance, aged 15. A gifted guitarist. He liked boys even though he thought I did not know. I loved him with everything I had. He would have made a great man. Alicia Vance, aged 14. She liked to paint and to shoot. She had her mother's mean streak. It would have served her well in the future. Elijah Vance, aged 8. The smartest of us all. These were Daniel's memorials to his family, and seeing the words lit up by my torch was a haunting insight into the overwhelming despair he'd endured. He must have realized he wouldn't get the chance to speak at his family's funerals or to write their obituaries. This was his last desperate way of making sure the world might one day know them as he did, as real people. The words marked the end of the tunnel, standing adjacent to a trapdoor in the ground. It was not open, but the tunnel came to a dead end immediately afterwards, and Ripley's prints disappeared at the hatch. I feared he might be in danger, but still I stopped and looked at the bunker door 20 meters behind me. The once gloomy forest looked so bright, even on this cloudy day, the air dotted with rain. A part of me felt like I was leaving the whole world behind as I began to climb the ladder down. I entered a large circular living space that was packed with furniture and little nooks and crannies. The walls were covered with folding beds and tables, and every inch was multifunctional. A dining space could become a sitting space, which in turn might be where someone slept or even exercised. It all depended on what particular bit of furniture you unfolded or unclipped or unfurled. 7 people in close quarters, nowhere near enough privacy. It made sense they went with this cluttered, overlapping use of space. But it was still a large room, bigger than most studio apartments. And there were a few corridors that led deeper into the earth, telling me the bunker had unseen depths. I looked for some sign of my dog and soon found his trail, but this far from the rainy copse Ripley's prints were starting to fade. After barely a few meters, they petered out vaguely in the direction of a nearby door. I wanted to follow, but stopped myself from rushing onwards. It was unlikely Ripley was getting out any other way, and I'd do us no good getting hurt myself. I decided to take a look around and quickly spotted a dinner table. If I needed proof the police had not bothered with a cleanup, this was it. The plates were still out, the food rotten to a strange blackened husk. A child's hat lay across one place setting. The once creamy fleece turned a sickly green and yellow. The chairs had their backs reinforced with wooden beams fitted with long grooves, so that something the width of a nail could slide into them. And on each of the cushions were foul-smelling stains that looked oddly like an ass print. I touched one with gloved hands, and the material crackled audibly. Whatever it was, similar stains were on the cutlery and plates, and there were even handprints of it placed firmly on the tablecloth. At first I thought it was blood, but that wasn't quite right. It was too contained to be from leaking blood. On the back of one of the chairs a stain tapered exactly where a woman's waist would be like a near-perfect silhouette. I shivered as I remembered that Miranda Vance had always been a slim woman and wondered how she had left her imprint on the gray fabric. Using my torch, I saw that these stains repeated in the oddest of places. Yes, there were some on beds and blankets, and even patches of plain floor exactly like you might expect in a room full of sick people. But why did one stain on the floor bear such a strong resemblance to a child huddled in the fetal position? And why was the same stuff all over the TV remote, and on books on shelves, and board games too? Everything from sofa cushions to DVD boxes to piles of dirty laundry were covered in the same dried brownish material that gave off a foul coppery miasma. I found the jigsaw particularly baffling. Someone had set up another table with 4 chairs, all modified with the same back support as those by the dinner table. And a jigsaw had been laid out with 4 separate piles, but only one was depleted. The rest looked largely untouched, almost like someone had portioned out pieces for 3 other people who had absolutely no interest in going along with it. Maybe Daniel had tried to keep up morale while the family were sick. God help me. If that were true, I couldn't help but imagine the poor man sat there with his loved ones close to death, desperately trying to encourage them to click their own pieces into place while they faded in and out of consciousness. Something about that room emanated madness, and the longer I stayed down there flicking the bright disk of light of my torch from one detail to another, the more I wanted to leave. One door had wooden beams nailed across it. One sofa had been partially disassembled. Multiple beds had been burned, and all the light bulbs had been removed and put in a box on the kitchen countertop. Looking up at the ceiling, I finally had some insight into why the police were so confident the Vances had not survived despite never finding their bodies. Someone had jammed a human finger into one of the empty sockets, almost like they'd expected it to glow with the flick of a switch. What was it about this place that had caused the police to leave and never return? Not to even take that finger and test it for signs of illness, or even just to confirm who it belonged to. I decided it was time to hurry up and find my dog. People had died in that place, and while I'm not superstitious, I can't be the only skeptic who has done the calculations in his head and realized it costs nothing to be respectful of ghosts. That bunker was cramped, terrifying, and the air stank so bad I started to worry I'd get sick myself. It served no one any good to linger, but I'd be damned if I'd just walk away and leave Ripley to rot down there. It's not like he could climb a ladder and get out on his own, even if I wasn't entirely sure how he'd gotten down there in the first place. Summoning what little bravery I had left, I called out and broke the silence, something which felt like a terrible taboo in that god-awful place, like screaming in a graveyard. "Ripley!" I waited and hoped to hell I'd hear the pitter-patter of his paws, but for the longest of moments there was only the kind of silence that makes you wonder if someone or something in the darkness is holding its breath, trying to look like just another patch of nothing, biding its time until you finally turn around and show it your back. The TV came on with a blurt of white noise that was so loud and so sudden I cried, threw my arms up, and nearly fell backwards onto a rolled-out sleeping bag that looked like it had spent a week in the sewer. By the time I realized what had caused the noise, I could already hear a tinny rendition of Daniel Vance's voice. I realized the issue here. I need to emphasize just how little I understand anything that's... I frowned at the screen as I approached. It showed a greenish infrared view of the bunker with Daniel up front, and the dinner table behind him. It was grainy and hard to see, but I could clearly tell that his family were sitting in those chairs. Miranda was first to fall ill. Looking back, it makes perfect sense. Miranda often went into storage to fetch food for cooking, and we found it behind one of the refrigerators. So that's shit. One of the figures in the background slumped onto the table with a loud clank and sent a plate spinning off onto the ground. "Shit, shit, shit," Daniel muttered as he got up and grabbed the woman by the shoulders and sat her upright. Miranda never did like my cooking. He snorted a laugh as he fussed with something at the back of the chair. "The rods are much better than tape." All those hours spent taping them upright to the chairs. Never worked. But the rods, they fit right into the spine, and with a little modification I can just slot them into the chairs. That way everyone is able to join in for dinner. I'm working on something similar for family game night. Daniel wandered over to the camera, and with a grin he lifted it from the tripod and scanned the dinner table. What I saw nearly made me drop my torch. His family were long dead. Gaunt faces, missing noses, lips that had receded to reveal awful grins. These were corpses, plain as day, even when viewed through such a low-resolution image. The only thing that made them seem remotely alive was the way their eyes still reflected the infrared back, so that they glowed in the dark. And yet Daniel seemed oblivious to it all. He tousled Elliot's hair, kissed his wife on the cheek, run a hand across one young girl's shoulder. He even picked the young Alexander up from his high chair, and I assume he coddled him. I don't know for sure because I looked away, unwilling to see the poor boy up close. Eyes averted from the screen, I couldn't help but pan my torch across to that same dinner table and shiver as I finally realized what all those stains were. Not quite blood, but close. Liquefying flesh. Left alone for months, Daniel had not put his family's bodies to rest. Instead, he had moved them around from place to place and puppeted them, living life as if nothing had really changed. Looking at where those stains had settled, I saw a clear pattern emerge. He had put them to bed. He had set them dinner. He had propped them up to watch TV, or gave them their favorite books. They even sat there as lifeless husks while Daniel waited for them complete a fucking jigsaw. The idea horrified me to my core. Back to work. It's obviously not part of the original designs. No room on the other side, not on the blueprints. Elliot didn't believe me, and why would he? I made every inch of this place, but I did not install that door in storage on the bottom level. I checked the cameras and some of the photos I took during the build, and the wall is just blank. But the door is there now, and it must lead somewhere. I don't know when or why it opens, but it does, and the next time I'll be ready. Because I have to know what's on the other side, and why it did this to us. Alone down here, often all asleep at once. Anything could have slit our throats and been done with it, but it didn't. It took its time, and I have to know why. It took our radios and computers and phones, one by one, none of us noticing until it was far too late. I kept telling the kids they needed to take better care of their things, and even as they complained, I just assumed the phones were lying behind some shelf. Where else could they go in a locked bunker? But it wasn't the children at all. Looking back, there are so many signs, who kept taking away the lights, who kept draining the batteries in our torches. How long did we live with it before we finally realized we weren't alone? Was it here every step of the way? A door out of nothing that leads to nowhere, at least most of the time. Because I know for a fact it does not always open onto a blank wall. There is something behind it. I can hear it shuffling around in there, wet breath rattling in its lungs. A horrible sound I hear roaming these halls when it thinks I'm asleep. I listened to Daniel, fascinated by this strangely compelling rant, when movement caught my eye. An infrared camera running in the dark, its image a roiling mess of uniform noise. What was it I'd seen? I paused the tape and rewound. Squinting, I saw two pinpricks of light in the darkness just over Daniel's shoulder. Slowly, the image resolved itself in my mind. I knew what I was seeing, and it turned my blood to ice. Miranda Vance had turned her head, and her lifeless eyes glowed as she fixed them on the back of Daniel's head. Not even any point leaving at this stage. I'm no doctor, but that door is giving off enough radiation to kill a family of 7. If none of us had touched it, being in the same room is risky, but not lethal. But given how sick we've become, it's pretty obvious our curiosity got the better of us, one by one, and we all got too close. Or maybe not. Maybe that thing on the other side came through and did this. I don't even can. Wait, what was that? Daniel turned, and the camera stopped recording. The image it froze on was of a lone man, bright as a star in the camera's lens, facing off against unknowable darkness broken only by 6 pairs of white, glowing eyes. I became painfully aware of my position relative to the table, and I had the painful premonition that if I turned, those chairs would not be empty. I would see the Vances, all of them, Daniel as well, waiting for me. Heads turned, bodies left to rot for years in the dark. Behind me something shifted. It breathed. Loud. Quick. I knew what it was. I knew. It came at me so fast that when I felt something hot and wet touch my hand I screamed, only for the presence to suddenly recoil. But then, without hesitation, it leapt at me and bore me to the ground. I wept as Ripley licked my face. He was shivering and, worst of all, silent, which was not normal. He was not a quiet dog, not when greeting me, and not when excited like he was now. But whatever he'd seen down here, he clung to me and dug his paws into my shoulders like he wanted to be cradled over the shoulder, something he has been too big to do for years. "Oh, you fucking idiot," I cooed in a soft whisper, and even in the dark I could feel his tail wagging. Joking aside, I felt nothing but relief at finding him. "Let's get the hell out of here." I picked him up, straining a little under the weight, but refusing to give in to tired muscles, and made for the ladder. It wasn't easy climbing the 3 or 4 rungs to the hatch, but I managed it and gave the hatch a shove. First one hand, then 2. Again and again, with everything I had, but still that hatch refused to budge. "Shit!" I cried while pounding at it with my fists, but all I achieved was a sore wrist. The hatch had jammed when, somehow, the handle had been snapped clean off. Now I'd need a pair of pliers or something to cut through the metal bar locking it shut. My fingers couldn't move it, nor could I brute force the hatch open. The metal bar was an inch thick, and, at the very least, I'd need some tools to get at it from this side. At least it's fixable, I thought as I climbed back down and caught my breath. On one wall I noticed a simple diagram of the bunker made in chalk. It had 3 floors. The bottom was storage. Daniel had mentioned that before, and I noticed that he had drawn through it with a large red X. And the top floor was labeled quarters, where I stood now. But the middle floor was labeled workshops, and it was there I realized that I'd find what I needed. There was one door that opened onto a concrete stairwell, and, standing at the top, I shone my light down the spiraling guard rails, unsure of what it was I hoped to see. There were only harsh shadows, and the sense of something foul rising up on the air. A smell that tickled my throat and burned a little in my lungs. Had the police even gone down this far? Had they seen what I'd seen on that TV and just left? Somehow I thought it was unlikely that had been enough to send the entire sheriff's department running. So was it something else that had done it? Something that had been enough to terrify dozens of armed men. Something that was almost definitely down there. The door. I went down quietly. At first I considered leaving Ripley behind, but after losing him the first time I decided I'd rather risk it just to know that he was right next to me. Besides, he was being quieter than I was, and I didn't feel much like going down those stairs on my own. He accompanied me with only the quiet click-clack of his paws on concrete, a sound I found deeply comforting as I barely managed to keep my torch from shaking in my hand and my breathing steady. Down 1 floor, and I found the workshop exactly as you might expect. A large space filled with generators and fuel and water tanks and boilers and heaters, and pretty much anything and everything that you'd need to survive, but which you couldn't put outside due to fallout. Wires, pipes, and tubes ran from one end of the room to the other, and even years later, most of the machinery still hummed in the pitch-black emptiness, an idea I found deeply unsettling. Taking one look at that strange tangle of harsh shapes and industrial figures looming out of the walls and floor, I shivered and looked around, quickly finding a small area Daniel had cordoned off for his own use. About a fifth of the total floor space, there was a large workbench and some seriously high-end machining equipment, all very well used. Lathes, buzzsaws, drills, belt sanders, welding torches, everything a man needed to do it himself. And Daniel had been busy. I'm not sure exactly what it was he'd been working, but there was an arm on the bench. It sat atop a pile of papers that had slowly turned brown over the years, until the whole thing looked like it had been soaked in tobacco spit. On the whiteboard was a faded but still visible diagram of what looked to me like a ball and socket joint. I thought of the tape, of Daniel's little mechanism to keep his family upright, and then looked at the arm and suppressed a momentary gag reflex. I don't know if Dan had been working on posable limbs, or just a way to put the decomposing remains back together after they'd started to fall apart, but the size of the arm suggested a preteen child, and he'd left it out on the surface like it was a disassembled clock. It was also missing a finger. Just how fucking crazy was he? I wondered as I pinched my nose with one hand and began overturning boxes looking for a hefty pair of pliers, or maybe a hacksaw. Ripley backed away from the noise, but once I made sure he wasn't going anywhere, I carried on grabbing and pulling at box after box, hoping I'd find what I was looking for. Anything to break that fucking metal bar. In the end I managed to get a pair of bolt cutters, a crowbar, and a heavy-duty pair of pliers. One went in my pocket, one went down the back of my jeans, and the other was clutched in my fist, too large to be tucked away in my clothes. The bolt cutters felt hefty in my hand, which was a bit of comfort, but that feeling didn't last long. Something moved in the darkness, Out there in the twisted jungle of shadows cast by all those pipes and wires that ran from one machine to the next, a figure moved, thin, but unmistakably human in its outline. I couldn't help but remember what I'd seen on that tape. Surely it couldn't have been real. Maybe Daniel had rigged something up. Some fishing wire and a motor, maybe? The idea that those bodies had been moving on their own. I couldn't be sure of that, could I? It was a frightening idea, one my mind had latched onto out of sheer panic. That was all. And then I saw them. A pair of white pinpricks reflecting back at me from the depths of that cluttered room. Ripley, already behind me, had nuzzled into my leg, pushed even closer against me, and let out a barely audible whine under his breath. The behavior of a dog who was terrified, close to pissing himself with fear. Just a bit of metal, I told myself as the light shook so violently in my hand I struggled to see straight. Just two shiny bits of metal. They blinked and began to come towards me. If I had any doubts left, they were dispersed by the sight of a pale white hand emerging into the light. I ran straight to the stairs and went to climb them, but only 1 or 2 steps in, and I saw something gripping the handrail on the top floor. A moldy clump of flesh, only just recognizable as a fist. The flesh withered until the fingers were basically bone. Without meaning to, I brought my light up out of habit, and I saw the bloated face of a hairless corpse glaring down at me. I couldn't even tell you if it had been a teenage girl or the 60-year-old Daniel. Either way, I instinctively turned and found another body shambling towards me out of the workshop. I was trapped. Nowhere to go. By the feel of warm fluid on the back of my leg, I could tell Ripley had finally pissed himself. An adult dog, tail between his legs, shivering like a puppy and desperate to be picked up. God, I needed him to just stay together for a little longer. I couldn't take him in my arms, but I couldn't leave him behind either. With nowhere to go, I ran down and entered storage. There was the temptation to stop once I hit the bottom. Down here the air was thicker, and the sounds of my breathing were muted, somehow distant. But I only had to look back up to see 3 pairs of eyes glaring down at me. So without giving any of it much further thought, I barreled down the corridor and stumbled onto a door at random. Opening it, I saw what looked like your standard storage room. Only most of the shelves had been overturned and the food left to rot on the floor. 1 or 2 shelving units were still upright though, and their shelves were covered in tall opaque boxes that made them a fantastic hiding spot. That, I decided, would have to be where I crouched down and turned off my light. I was already inside when I realized that wasn't all that was in there. The door almost looked normal. I could see why Daniel must have been confused by it, because it looked a little bit like all the other doors down there, but it was different too. It was too tall and too wide, about 1.5 feet off the ground, and the metal rusted in its entirety like it had aged out of sync with everything else down there. All around the jam was a profusion of wet soppy moss like the kind you find hanging off trees in a swamp, and every few seconds the door would leak something strange and oily, like the kind of thing you find in a parking lot on a rainy day. Of course that wasn't too strange in itself, but the leak was horizontal, defying gravity, so that every few seconds a large glob of the stuff would whip across the room and slap into the wall opposite, creating a puddle about the size of a man that defied all reason. Remembering Daniel's words about radiation, I instinctively inched away from this puddle and the door on the opposite wall. Backing myself into the darkest, quietest corner I could while I pulled Ripley behind me and hoped to hell he wouldn't give me away. Once I was in there, I turned off my light and waited. I must have taken longer than I'd thought to hide Spot, because it was barely 2 seconds later when a few figures entered the room. It was pitch black after I'd turned off my torch, but they made enough noise to let me know that at least 2 of them had stumbled in after me. I stayed there, unable to see anything, not sure if they were heading straight for me or just getting ready to leave, forced to hold out and let luck decide my fate. When I finally heard something scrape against the wall barely 2 feet from where I stood, I gave up and switched my light on, desperate to know what was coming for me. The sound had been terribly misleading. Daniel Vance was no more than 6 inches from my face. "Get out!" he hissed from a toothless and cracked mouth. A living corpse just like the others, somehow a flash of intelligence remained in those wide, terrified eyes. And then I heard it, the creaking of a door, and without even thinking I turned the light and saw it on the wall. I saw it open, and behind the strange steel there was more than just plain old concrete. Much more. I saw a raging gullet of flesh, a ringed tube of pulsing muscle lined with teeth the size of hands, a spiraling descent into madness. Hot foetid air washed into the room, buffeting me and the rotting corpses, all of us paralyzed by what we were seeing, even if for most of the figures beside Daniel and myself, They didn't have eyes to see with. "What the fuck?" I muttered, unable to take my eyes from the flesh tube beyond that doorway. "It's coming," Daniel whispered as he grabbed me with one fist and hurled me out of the room. I hit the floor and skidded along a slick fluid left by the Vance's footprints, the smell of which turned my stomach. Perhaps the worst detail was that it was cold. I don't know why, I just expected whatever oozed them off them to be feverishly hot. But it wasn't. It soaked my shirt like I'd fallen into a muddy puddle. "It's coming." This voice wasn't Daniel's. I couldn't say for sure, but it sounded like a child's whisper. One by one the bodies shuffled over to the open door and knelt before it. I don't know why, but I got the impression the others had lost pretty much everything left of their minds, but Daniel remained aware. He looked back at me once more and spoke before he pressed his head to the floor in supplication with the others. "The only thing we did wrong was being here for it to torture. It didn't need a reason, just an opportunity. Leave. It won't let us go. It won't even let us die. And if it catches you, it won't let you go either." His forehead kissed the dirt, and then something reached through the door and gripped his head in its palm the way you, or I might pick up an apple. In full panic, I ran over and grabbed my dog in the bolt cutters, and I ran like my legs were pistons, machines whose signals of exhaustion and fatigue could not slow me down or cause me to fall. I had to move. I had to leave. The hand that had grabbed Daniel, the sight of it flushed my mind clean like some kind of enema. It hurt to see the image replay in my mind, but there was nothing else in my head echoing around except the sight of fingers with one too many knuckles and nails as large as a smartphone. I reached the top floor and nearly collapsed from breathlessness, but I wouldn't let myself stay down for long. I crawled over to the ladder and climbed up and immediately went to work trying to cut the metal lock. It was hell with just one hand, the other clinging to the torch that I kept frantically pointing at the door behind me. And it wasn't long before I fumbled one too many times and dropped my only source of light. No, I mewed. But there was no time to look for it. I had to get out, and I had to get out fast. I couldn't see, but I was sure I could hear something climbing up those stairs. Not the steady thump-thump of human feet. No, this was different. This was a rapid pitter-patter of a spider, maybe. Something with hundreds of feet or hands, or God knows what, skittering along the floor and walls and ceiling, pulling itself along with a body whose mere shape would offend God. Using all my strength, I leaned hard on the bolt cutters, and at last the bolt gave. I threw the hatch open and got just enough ambient light to see Ripley hovering at the bottom of the ladder, growling ineffectually at the doorway. I crouched down, scooped him up, and fled up the ladder so quickly that my muscles turned to jelly at the top, and I fell over onto hands and knees. But still I was out. The long corridor covered in writing was ahead of me, and at the very end a doorway capped now by the tired blue light of a full moon. Ripley needed no encouragement. He whipped down the corridor with canine speed, and I followed at a broken and stumbling crawl, eventually shouldering past the open door and collapsing onto the forest floor. For a few seconds I drifted in and out of consciousness, but when I looked up and saw the canopy overhead moving, the branches backlit by a full moon, I snapped awake and glared down at something gripping my ankle. The hand had reached out of the dark and seized me, and was slowly dragging me back into the earth below. Whatever it was, most of its body lurked out of sight in the shadows behind the doorway, but the hand that crushed my leg was the size of my torso with an arm that looked like it belonged to a mole rat. I struck it with my own fist. I dug my nails in. I cried and kicked and screamed, but nothing could stop it. From behind the door, something like a face grinned and leered at me with joy. It was taking its time, sure enough, pulling me in so slowly that it gave my mind all the time in the world to appreciate the nightmare that awaited me. I think if, in that moment, you'd given me a gun, I would have shot myself because God help me I couldn't escape the look in Daniel's eyes. How he'd knelt to worship this thing like a man who knew that hope or pride or joy or anything with even a hint of goodness to it was so far out of reach for him it might as well be a dream. How long was this thing going to keep them down there? How long did it intend to keep me? I wept like a child, feeling like my mind was slowly cracking as I tried everything to stop that fucking pulling me into the shadows. I kicked at the earth. I dug into it using my hands looking for a root or a pipe or anything to hold on to. Nothing I did would slow it down. I was no more than a foot from the doorway when Ripley reappeared. A dog afraid of hoovers and plastic bags and doors that move on their own. A dog who once got stared down by a particularly feisty rabbit who stopped mid-chase and turned around, baffling the predator on its tail. A dog you couldn't even watch scary movies around. And he lunged at that arm like he was a wolf, like he'd always been one. And while he didn't quite break the skin, the pressure was enough to make the thing's grip weaken, and I slid my leg out. Unable to stand, I knelt and grabbed the dog and pulled as hard as I could, and now that fucking thing bled at last as the pressure of the jaws and the sliding teeth ripped into its flesh. Together, at last, Ripley and I were let go and sent rolling backwards head over hells. I wasted no time waiting or looking or processing. I heaved the dog to my chest and crawled until I passed out, making it maybe half a kilometer away. Only when I could no longer see the door did I let myself fall to the ground face first and gave up consciousness. The doctors said I had pneumonia, which I suppose made some kind of sense. I might have even believed them were it not for the sheriff's visit, asking strange questions of me as I lay in bed about what I may or may not have seen. I dismissed them to the best of my ability. I wasn't interested in chasing that particular nightmare down, figuring out if it had been real or not, at least not while I lay there half drowning in my own infection. To be fair, I had at least some sympathy for why the police had done so little to seal that place off. I have, on occasion, thought about going and doing the job myself, but to this day I still have nightmares about being pulled into the dark beyond that door. Not just the bunker door, the one I narrowly avoided at the end, but the one below. What I saw was a kind of madness, I'm sure of it, and I often think of Daniel's words. It didn't need a reason, just an opportunity. Somehow, the Van Cess were that opportunity. Maybe they built their bunker on a ley line, or a weak spot between dimensions, or the site of former satanic rituals. I'm not sure it even matters. They went into the dark thinking it'd be a safe place to wait out the world's troubles, but something had been down there waiting for them, waiting for a chance to get at a family of 7 people, to lock them in and deprive them of escape and slowly take from them everything it could. I've moved since then. Couldn't help it. It wasn't just the memories you see. It was the shortwave radio I kept in my basement. Something my father passed on to me when I was just a boy. God, I'd forgotten about it. At least until I woke up one day to the sound of it blaring white noise down in the dark. And buried in that sound was the faint whispering of a man, his voice barely recognizable, but unmistakably his. Let them go, 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 let them go. I watched from a distance while my grandma and grandpa fished on their lake in the backyard, but one thing confused me. While grandpa cast his line and watched his rod, waiting for the anticipating tug of a fish, grandma's gaze remained fixed across the lake, her head tilted intently towards the dark fringe of woods. I never saw her look at the bobbing lures. She didn't even seem interested in fishing at all. I thought that maybe she just simply enjoyed looking at the trees. But a nagging feeling persisted. There was more to her gaze than a simple love for nature. It was summer break, and I decided to spend it at my grandparents' house in Knoxville, Tennessee. They lived in a 2-story house, recently built in 2018. It connected directly to a lake, with a dock jetting out on the far right side where my grandpa kept his bass boat. My grandparents were a sweet and quiet couple. They kept to themselves most of the time, living a peaceful life in their little corner of the world. Every summer, though, my visits became a tradition. Grandma's invitation was always an automatic yes, her warm smile and gentle voice a beacon calling me back. There were countless things to love about my grandma, her kindness and generosity at the top of the list. If I wanted something, it was usually an automatic yes from her too. But one of the things I truly cherished most was her stories. Unlike Grandpa, who mostly stuck to tales of his time in the military, exciting stories filled with bravery and adventure, of course, Grandma was a bottomless well of stories. Whether it was a funny story from her childhood, a heartwarming story about a kind neighbor, or a fantastical bedtime story that transported me to magical lands, Grandma always had one on hand. She was one of those special grandmas who could weave a story from thin air, her words painting vivid pictures in my mind. Grandpa, on the other hand, was a man of few words. A quiet strength emanated from him, and the stories he did tell were always about his service. He'd talk about the places he'd been, the challenges he'd faced, and the lessons he'd learned. While not as fantastical as Grandma's stories, they held a different kind of magic, a testament to his resilience and the experiences that shaped him. One of the things I always admired about Grandpa was his outdoor skills. He'd tell me most of his knowledge came from his military training, jokingly saying they prepared him for anything. He was a true outdoorsman, the kind of person I'd trust implicitly if we were ever lost in the wilderness. He knew everything about fishing, the best spots on the lake, the best techniques to catch different types of fish. Some of my favorite memories were spent on his boat, cutting through the cool morning water, the sun rising over the horizon, and the gentle hum of the motor a comforting lullaby. Every night, Grandma dipped into her seemingly endless well of stories. I never quite understood how she did it. Her mind was like a sprawling library, shelves overflowing with stories to tell. One night, she'd tell me a story of brave knights seeking vengeance, their swords gleaming in the sun. Another night, she'd tell me a story of a land shimmering with magic spells and cursed lands. Then there were the scary stories. Now, Grandma usually avoided them. She knew how they affected me. But the thing about those stories was the detail. Oh man, the detail. They were so vivid, so real, it felt like I was peeking through a crack into another world. A world where the monsters and creatures she described lurked. A world so terrifying that I felt like falling through that crack would kill me. Every night was the same routine. Nestled under a patchwork quilt in the guest room, I'd wait with bated breath. The soft click of the doorknob was my cue. Grandma, her face etched with a lifetime of stories, would enter, a gentle smile gracing her lips. She'd pull up a rocking chair, its rhythmic creak adding to the lullaby effect. Then, in a warm voice, she'd begin telling me a story. One night, though, tucked under the patchwork quilt, I waited for Grandma's nightly visit. The soft click of the doorknob announced her arrival. "Ready for another story?" she asked, her voice a warm rumble. I nodded eagerly. Nights at Grandma's were journeys to magical lands, each story more thrilling than the last. But tonight, I craved a different kind of story, a different kind of excitement. "Can you tell me a scary story tonight, Grandma?" I blurted out. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, followed by a thoughtful pause. Unlike her usual repertoire of action-packed adventures, her stories have always steered clear of scary ones. She sat beside me on the patchwork quilt, her usual mischievous eyes replaced by a thoughtful gaze. Her eyes flickered towards the window for a moment before returning to me. Then, with a gentle smile, she began. "Those woods outside your window," she started, her voice a warm rumble. I instinctively glanced towards the window, the familiar silhouette of the trees, outlined across the lake. "There's something in those woods," she continued, her voice dropping to a hushed whisper. A shiver danced down my spine, though the room remained pleasantly warm. Those simple words made me so uncomfortable that I was tempted to just tell Grandma to stop. But the truth was, I was hooked. Grandma did tell me scary stories on rare occasions, but they were always fictional, completely disconnected from the real world. She continued, "Every 7 years, it comes out of those woods. It emerges, a creature that's been on this earth for thousands of years. It crawls on all fours. It hunts, a silent predator searching for its prey." I began to tense up a little. The room remained quiet, but the air felt heavy. "Its body is like a man, but twisted and contorted," she murmured, "and its limbs elongated, reaching out at odd angles. Its skin is black as coal, making it difficult to spot during the night." I swallowed hard, my eyes instinctively drawn back to the window. The trees, once comforting, now seemed to writhe with unseen shadows. "But the worst part," she continued, her voice barely a tremor, "is its eyes, multiple eyes, scattered across its head like a spider. They pierce the darkness, searching for an unsuspecting victim." She continued, her voice a hushed whisper, sending shivers down my spine. "Sometimes, if it has trouble finding prey, it ventures closer, closer to houses, searching for unlocked windows." My breath caught in my throat. The image of eyes peering through the glass sent a jolt of terror through me. "If it finds an opening," she murmured, "it will crawl inside and snatch the closest person to it, dragging them back to the woods." I squeezed my eyes shut, the warmth of the quilt a poor barrier against the sudden chill. "It keeps its victims alive for 7 long years," she whispered, "feeding off them slowly, until the hunger returns, and it's time to hunt once more." My grip tightened on the blanket, and my knuckles were white. A cold sweat was dripping down my skin. "But don't you worry," she said, her voice gentling. "As long as we keep the windows locked, we'll be safe. And don't forget to do the same at your mom's house." She rose from the quilt, her smile strained at the edges. A smile meant to reassure, but one that couldn't hide the sliver of unease in her eyes. Her movements seemed slow and deliberate as she walked towards the window. My eyes followed her, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. She stared out of the window for a moment, as if checking to make sure the thing wasn't around, and then she checked to make sure the window was locked. Just as she was about to turn away, I blurted out, unable to contain the question that had lodged itself in my throat. "Grandma, have you ever seen it?" She paused for a few moments, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face, before a reassuring smile crept onto her lips. She didn't answer me. She simply leaned down and kissed my forehead, a gesture filled with a strange intensity. "Good night, darling," she whispered. Then, with a gentle click, she shut my door behind her. I was awake for most of that night, staring at the darkened window pane. The familiar silhouette of the woods outside now held a new kind of terror. I kept wondering if I would see that face my grandma described, a face with multiple eyes staring back at me. Eventually, exhausted from fear and lack of sleep, my eyelids drifted shut, and I finally drifted off. While I slept, I dreamt of its form shifting and writhing in the darkness. I ran, my legs pumping, but it was like I was running on ice. Panic seized me as the figure lunged, its long arms wrapping around my legs. It dragged me, a ragdoll, through the grass, the stench of damp grass filling my nostrils. The woods grew bigger as the thing dragged me there, its jagged edges threatening to devour me whole. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just as the branches of the trees were about to engulf me, I jolted awake, gasping for breath. Light streamed through the window, painting familiar shapes on the ceiling. The room held a peaceful stillness. It took several deep breaths to slow the pounding of my heart. Relief washed over me, chasing away the lingering dread. Since that night, despite Grandma's steady stream of new stories, the creature in the woods has remained a constant shadow in the corner of my mind. Thankfully, the nightmares, those terrifying chases through endless woods, didn't last. Slowly, the story faded from memory. A few years later, a different kind of darkness descended upon our family. Cancer, a cruel, selfish thief, stole my grandmother's health bit by bit. She fought for months, but in the end, the disease won. It left a hole in our lives, especially for Grandpa. Now he lives alone, the silence of the house heavy with her absence. Talking about her seems to bring a fresh wave of pain, etched deep into the lines on his face. Sometimes, he murmurs about just waiting for his turn to join her. It's a heartbreaking sight, a man transformed into a solitary figure, simply waiting to die. That year was a blur of grief, a dark tunnel we all had to navigate. But with the love and support of family and friends, we eventually managed to pull through. With each passing year, the grief lessened, but Grandma's memory remained. Then, after another few years, during my senior year in high school, something happened. I walked into the house after a long day. The familiar scent of an empty house greeted me. Mom had already left for work. Pulling my backpack onto my bed, I pulled out my books and settled in for an evening of homework, studying, and the occasional break to watch TV. I shut off the TV, changed into my pajamas, and crawled into bed. Sleep, however, remained elusive. My mind was a tangled mess, tossing and turning over the events of the day. Finally, I peeked at the clock on my desk, its green glow reading almost 3 a.m. Just then, a sound shattered the silence, a sharp tap that echoed through the room. My eyes flew open, snapping towards the window. A wave of ice washed over me, freezing my blood solid. Memories of Grandma's story flooded back. The creature, the woods. There, pressed against the glass, was a form that blocked most of the moonlight from filtering in. If not for the sliver of moonlight peeking in around what was blocking it, I wouldn't have been able to see it at all. Its human-shaped body pressed against the window, and across its head, I could have sworn I saw movement. A flicker, like multiple tiny insects scurrying across its flesh. Then, a horrifying realization dawned on me. They weren't insects. They were eyelids. Eyelids flickering open and shut, scanning my room with frantic urgency. My breath hitched. Was this a dream? Just then, a shadowy limb, long and impossibly thin, snaked out towards the base of my window. Had I locked the window? The sickening sound of the window, as the glass began to slide up, hit my ears. Terror choked and screamed in my throat. There are woods behind my mom's house too, and a sickening realization dawned on me. This wasn't just a story. It was real, and it was here. Adrenaline surged through me, and my flight or fight responses kicked in. I threw myself out of bed in a desperate scramble. My feet pounded the floor as I bolted towards the door, flinging it open, but my escape was cut short. The door slammed shut in my face, the force of it throwing me backward. A strangled cry escaped my lips as a wave of terror washed over me. My body locked up, and every muscle seized in a silent scream. Somehow it was now in my room, that fast, it was no longer at the window. It was now above me, above my door. One of its grotesquely long limbs, tipped with a hand like a spider's claw, pressed firmly against the door, pinning me inside. Another seemed contorted at an unnatural angle. Its fingers splayed against the wall in a grotesque parody of a grip. The head, if you could call it that, twisted on its neck in a way that defied human anatomy, almost spinning completely around. A chorus of eyes locked onto me. Trapped and alone, I stumbled back, my mind scrambling for any flicker of hope. The second floor was an escape route, but a leap out the window would likely result in injury, leaving me in a vulnerable position. Besides, that's where it probably wanted me. Right next to the door stood my wooden baseball bat. In a desperate lunge, I grabbed it, the wood rough against my grip. With a yell, I swung the bat with all my strength, connecting with a sickening thud. Splinters of wood rained down as the impact sent a tremor through the room. The creature recoiled slightly, its multiple eyes flickering in what might have been surprise. But the silence that followed was the most unsettling part. No roar of pain, no growl. This thing moved with an unnatural quiet. Even as it moved, it made no noise. It descended to the floor, its grotesque form dwarfing the space in my room. As it loomed closer, lowering its body in a predatory crouch, I swung the mangled bat wildly. The bat connected, with a bone-crunching impact, sending more shards of wood flying through the air. The creature recoiled, its grotesque form momentarily faltering. Seizing my chance, I bolted past the thing, flung open the bedroom door, and slammed it shut behind me with a resounding bang. Adrenaline pumping, I raced down the stairs, each step echoing in the sudden silence. Reaching the living room, I fumbled for the light switch, illuminating the space with a warm glow. Panting, I gripped the broken bat like a lifeline. Its splintered end pointed towards the top of the stairs, towards the thing in my room. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the tense silence, the creak of the front door opening. A silhouette emerged from the doorway, the dim porch light casting long shadows across her face. "There you are," my mom's voice, laced with exhaustion. "What the hell are you?" The sentence died on her lips, completely cut short. Her eyes widened, but neither she nor I had time to react. In a sharp and quick moment, a shadowy, distorted limb, tipped with a spidery claw, shot out, wrapping around my mother's waist. It snagged her, sinking its talons deep into her flesh, a sickening tear echoing in the sudden silence. A strangled noise bubbled in her throat, cut short before it could form a scream. But then, I heard her scream fully formed as the thing dragged her away to the woods. I ran with all my effort, but the thing was fast, too fast. All I could do was keep running, watching, as my mom screamed with her arms folded around the creature's arm in a desperate attempt to escape. It had her, though, exactly where it wanted her, out in the open. I fell face first into the grass, a sob wrenching its way out of my chest. Warm tears streamed down my face, blurring my vision as I watched in horror. Mom's screams turned into blood-curdling shrieks, fading into a horrifying silence, as they disappeared into the indistinguishable maw of the woods. The police came, but what could they do? What could I tell them? I told them exactly what I saw. They looked at me like I was crazy, but what else could I say? For hours, I sat in a sterile interrogation room, the harsh overhead light blurring my vision. They questioned me over and over, dissecting my story, searching for inconsistencies. But all I could do was repeat the horrifying scene, my voice cracking with each retelling. There was no evidence to tie me to my mom's disappearance, nothing but my frantic pleas and the raw terror etched onto my face. Finally, they seemed to reach a reluctant roadblock. With a sigh and a dismissive glance, they released me. Now a search party combs the backyard, venturing into the dense woods behind our house. Bloodhounds sniff the damp earth, their mournful howls echoing through the trees. In my room, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. As the harsh light of dawn breaks, I stare at the window. A large handprint, a grotesque, splayed imprint of multiple fingers, clings to the outside of the glass. A cold realization settles over me. Now I know that at least one of my grandma's stories is real. True Internet Ghost Stories wasn't my favorite pod, but I had nothing else to listen to. The gym demanded something to distract myself from the constant pain I was in on my quest to become the Quad Father. So TIGS's was. I don't think they used that acronym, by the way, but how could I avoid it? It sounded adorable. The pod followed a basic formula. The host found an allegedly true scary story online and read it. He would add asides, comments like, "Did this really happen?" He'd say, without any irony, "So far this sounds so very true, but let's see where it goes, listeners." He called everyone listeners, except for his co-host, whom he called fellow traveler. She only talked in the beginning and end of the episodes, and they seemed to have some sort of complicated history, although I doubted it was romantic. Their chemistry was terrible. So after the first 5 minutes of discussing their respective weekends and plugging their Patreon, they began to read the post. I was on my second set of split squats when I started noticing something strange about the story they were reading. It seemed oddly familiar. As it continued, the details kept amassing, to a point where I was unable to was a coincidence. It was describing something that happened to me, something I had never told anyone, and had only gone through with one other person. But everything it was saying was wrong. I finished my exercises early, skipped the showers, and drove home in a rush. I listened to it again when I got back to the apartment, the story echoing around the walls from my smart speaker. When it finished, I listened again. Halfway through I began to Google key phrases, trying to see where they had found this story. Nothing, nowhere, no hits. It wasn't online anywhere, or if it was, I couldn't find it. In the middle of a clawing, desperate anxiety, this drove me insane for some reason. Wasn't this allegedly from the internet? If it was, there should be some kind of trace somewhere. But instead it was all dead ends. I Googled the pod and found an email where you could send comments about the show or submit a story. It could have been submitted, but then I thought of the host saying this story was brand new. There was no way this was just submitted because the only other person other than me who knew this story, the person whose viewpoint the whole story was from, they couldn't have sent the email in. My email to the pod was insane, partially caps locked, sent unedited in the context of an ever-escalating panic attack. I demanded information about where they got the story, who sent it in, their contact info, anything. I was surprised to get a response, although I guess the people who run a paranormal podcast are probably used to getting unhinged emails. They said they couldn't provide me any personal info, but thanked me for being a fan and linked their Patreon. They said we are together on the roads. I read the email as the episode kept playing. It was entitled A Long Drive Home, and I listened again. I was in college, out of state, and I made friends with a guy in my dorm who, it turned out, was from around where I had grown up. I don't want to give details. I'm sorry if this is vague, but I'm not comfortable with it. For Thanksgiving break I was going to fly home, but he told me a few weeks before he was going to drive back and asked if I wanted a ride. The flight was expensive, and this seemed a much better option. We both got along, lived on the same floor, saw each other pretty regularly. The ride was only 5 hours, not super long. We would split gas and avoid the airport lines. It felt like a win-win. Our last classes were at noon on Tuesday, so we decided to leave then. We'd make it back by 6 or 7 at the latest, depending on how often we stopped. I meet up in his room, and we walked to the student parking lot. We had hung out a bunch as a group, but only a few times without anyone else. I was worried it would be awkward, but everything felt normal. We drove off, getting onto the interstate after 20 minutes of driving. We had eaten before leaving, hoping to save some time. The drive was uneventful for the beginning, listening to some playlist. Then he put on a podcast. The pod was kind of weird. Some guy talking about how there are patterns in the world, and he travels back and forth looking for them. After a few minutes I asked if we could listen to music again, and he said, just wanted to hear 2 more minutes. Even though it was cold outside, the car had started to feel warm. The sun was coming through the windows, and I was getting that overwhelmed, too hot in the car feeling. Vaguely nauseous, headache. The droning voice over the speaker didn't help. I remember the guy saying, you are on the path when the world outside the path begins to vanish. The signs you are seeking you. That's when he turned it off. Indie pop filled the car again, but there was too much treble. I chugged some water and coughed. He asked if I was okay at the same time we passed a sign for a rest stop in 2 miles. I said I was fine, but wondered if we could stop there. Sure, he said, no problem. 2 minutes later we were there. The rest stop was desolate. 1 car parked at the far left of the lot. No one else. We pulled in next to the handicapped parking area and got out. I had been hoping the fresh air would make me feel better, but no go. I still felt overheated and anxious. He said he had to use the bathroom and walked over to the desolate-looking building. It had a low roof and was the gray bruised color of storm clouds. Behind it, an overwhelming forest loomed. Something about the unending aspect of the trees began to overwhelm me. How could I tell if they were even real? There would be no way to tell if they just repeating images, one section of forest glitched, repeating infinitely. When they walked out of the bathroom, they went straight back to the car. I thought they would come over, say hi, be normal, but they didn't. I took one last look at the trees, hoping they would stop looking like, well, the way they were. But they still seemed eerie. Turning to walk away, I happened to glance at the park bench and see there was a drawing on it. A long red line, an arrow with points on both ends. Across the top, strange words, Latin I think. Quisque suas pater manes. I should have seen that before. I remember thinking, I had been right here. I would have noticed a drawing. But I hadn't. Because there wasn't anything there, I thought. But that was crazy. Things don't just appear. Do they? He honked the car and I jumped. I looked back and I could only see his shadow behind the wheel. Stay calm, I thought, as I trudged across the grass, away from the trees and picnic bench. You're just weirding out. This is a normal day. Stop freaking out. I got in the car and we started to drive. The podcast was back on, and I didn't say anything. He was completely silent, staring straight ahead. I closed my eyes, tried to relax. I hadn't gotten a lot of sleep the past few days because of midterms. Maybe I just needed a nap. I'd felt better, I thought. As I drifted off to sleep, I listened to the podcast. When we travel the roads, we think we are searching for answers, but what we must realize is that there are others who have been there before us, who are still there. When we go into the dark, they are waiting for us, and it is they who ride down the long roads. We are passengers. We are spectators. We are hosts. The words faded as I slipped into sleep. Weird dreams, confusing images. A graveyard where people buried themselves. A school where secret doors contained passages into strange wooded areas filled with wolves and what looked like vampires. An ancient lighthouse where I waited for the end of the world to come in from the sea. The car jerked to a halt, and I woke up suddenly. My mouth was fuzzy and I was disoriented. Where are we? I asked. A rest stop, he answered. I needed to take a break. Okay, I said, yawning. He opened the door and walked out. I blinked and then saw where we were. A low-slung rest stop off the highway. One car in the distance. A picnic table. Never-ending woods. No, I started muttering, panic in my voice. This isn't happening. This isn't real. It's a dream. Wake up, wake up, wake up. I screwed my hands into fists and banged my legs with them, scratched my palms with my fingernails. I had to do something to stop sleeping, stop dreaming. The podcast was still talking, even though the car was off. There are two worlds we know of, it said. The living and the dead. There are some who are in one or the other. Some are in both. We can move in each, but we must be careful. There are debts. I jumped out of the car. I didn't run to the trees. I didn't run to the building. Instead, I jogged across the parking lot, to the car at the other end of the lot. The sun was low in the sky and it seemed to white, giving off a dull shining glow, like silver. Was it even the sun? It didn't feel like the sun. The other car was a black SUV with black windows. I saw myself reflected as I ran to it, but something about me looked wrong. I felt sick, suddenly nauseous. I stopped moving and waited. That's when I saw him come out of the bathroom. His shadow wasn't. I don't know how to explain it. The sun was above and in front of him, so his shadow should have been behind him. But it wasn't. It was in front of him, and it was stretching out across the pavement, long and skinny and strange, like black tape, getting closer to me while he stood, watching. My heart bursting, I ran to the other car, slammed my hands against the windows, screamed for help. The car started. There was a whirring noise. The window came down. I was in the car, in the driver's seat. It was the car I had driven there in. The me in the car looked at me and whispered, "I'm sorry," and then the window closed and I fell down to the ground. I don't know what happened next, or how it happened, but I was back at home. My mom said she ran out to the grocery store, and when she got back I was there, on the couch. I didn't ask any questions. I told her I was sock and went to my room. My phone was there, and there were a million texts and notifications. I started reading through them. They were asking if I was okay, if I had heard. They said the guy I had driven back home with had posted a suicide note and killed himself. I don't know what to do. That's why I emailed this. Because I don't think the person who died was really the person who drove me here. I don't think I'm the person I was, or maybe there's another me somewhere. I could swear I heard my voice downstairs a few minutes ago, talking to my mother. That's how the podcast ends. All of it was wrong. First off, they were driving. I didn't have a car at school freshman year. They lived on my hall, and when we found out we lived close to each other, they offered me a ride home. And there was no podcast. We had a shared playlist, we played the whole there. And when only stopped once. We both used the bathroom, and I got out first. I do remember looking at the T's. I remember thinking they also looked like they repeated. But I didn't say that to them at all. I don't understand how they were saying that. The Latin phrase. I googled it. Quisque suas pater manes. It's from the Aeneid. It means we all suffer the same ghosts. I don't know what any of this means. The whole ride with them was weird. At some point I fell asleep, and it seemed like it was too long. I had these strange dreams, although I forgot them until now. I had seen myself in a car, driving with sunglasses on. I walked over to the car, and the me in the car took the sunglasses off. They had no eyes. Above me the whole sky was white, and the clouds were blue, and the sun was a silver coin that stole all the heat from me. The ending is all messed up. I'm alive. I didn't die. I woke up in the car, and we were in front of my house. Well, here you are, they said. End of the road. What about you, I asked. Are you close? No, they said. I have a long way to go. They drove off, and I went inside. I thought everything was done. I said hi to my parents, played with the dog. My dad asked me if I made good time, and I said decent, and then he asked me if I could move the car into the garage. I went out, thinking he wanted me to move his car, but I was surprised to see the car I had just been in, out there on the curb. I walked over and saw no one in the driver's seat. Maybe for a second I thought I saw them, or a shadow, but then the clouds moved, and I saw there was nothing. No one. I was holding a key fob, and when I clicked the button the doors opened. I slid in, checked the glove compartment, registration, and insurance card with my name. I grabbed my phone and saw our texts were gone. We weren't friends on social media. They were gone. Nowhere. The next few days were crazy. I thought I had gone nuts. People don't disappear. Cars don't just appear. All my memories weren't fake. They were real. I met them. I knew them. But no one else did. This was years ago, and I had finally sort of given up thinking about it. And then I heard this podcast. Everything they said was wrong, but I think they might have been telling the truth. I don't know what happened to them. I don't know what happened to me. But I don't know if I'm me. I keep thinking of those dreams, and what they said about the two worlds. I think I was in the other one. My car is outside, and I can see someone in it. They're in the driver's seat. I think they look like me. Maybe it's a shadow, a reflection. Maybe it's nothing. But maybe we're all only shadows, visible in some kinds of daylight, but not in others.